Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to part 2 of our series on Kabbalat Shabbat. Tonight you'll need the sources, which I sent in the chat, and you'll also need a Siddur. Don't worry, this is an Art Scroll Siddur. You don't have to use an Art Scroll Siddur. You can use any Siddur you like, but we'll probably get into that shortly. If you can't hear me or there's any technical issues, just let me know in the chat so I could figure that out accordingly. So this is part 2 of our series of Kabbalat Shabbat, as we're going to explore together the prose and the prayers. Last week, for those who are with us, this will be a quick recap. For those who weren't, just more information. Last week, what we spoke about in terms of Kabbalat Shabbat was the duality of the term Kabbalat Shabbat. Does Kabbalat Shabbat refer to the notion of Kabbalat Ta'anit, like the notion of accepting upon ourselves the restrictions that come with Shabbat? Or alternatively, does the word Kabbalat Shabbat have more to do with like a Kabbalat Panim? In the same way that we say like Boi Kala, there's a Kabbalat Panim, we go and we greet the bride, we greet the Shabbat queen, the Shabbat bride. So is that what Shabbat is really about? And we said that really it's two sides of the same coin. And we talked last week a little bit about how that duality is really the way that we should be approaching Shabbat. That Shabbat, when we think about its restrictions, are really not restrictions. They're an opportunity for us to really get to a much higher level and experience the beauty that is Shabbat. And we saw a beautiful Gemara at the end of last class that served as a good model for that. And so tonight, what I want to spend a little bit more time in is digging deeper into the actual structure of Kabbalat Shabbat. And just to do so, let's start with where we left off last week. And so this will be just a quick review again for those who are not who were with us last time. Someone says they don't see the source sheet. Let me try sending it again. 1 second. I'm hoping it comes through. Hold on. Brad, let me know if this works this time. I'm dragging it.
Whether we look in the chat.
Yeah.
I have them. I was able to download, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you. Sandy said he got it also. Okay, Brad, let me know if you're having trouble still. Okay, John's got it. Okay, good. Well, if we're really stuck, I'll put it on the screen. I'll try. I'm trying to manage. It's like a whole production studio we have here at TRM now. Multiple cameras, multiple angles. It's very high tech. It's only the best for us. So let's jump in. So when we talk about Shabbat, we know look in sources 3 and 4, for example. Source 4 should hopefully be a little bit familiar, as it's going to be something that we're going to read in the coming week's Parshiot, and something we say every Shabbat. So look in first source number 3. And what emerges from this first source, I'm sorry, Brad. I'm going to see if I can get it to you another way. Just give me a moment. So what we see from this first source is the nature of how Shabbat, if you look at Shabbat, Shabbat is really a universal idea. It's not just a particular Jewish idea, right? That God gave Shabbat, like Kadesh Shoto, right? Everybody experienced Shabbat. And so that is the first piece of we look at Shabbat. On the other hand, when we look at source number 4, notice how Shabbat is given in this context. So Shamru b'nei Yisrael HaShabbat, La'asot et HaShabbat le'rotam brit olam. The Jewish people, us, we've been given the Shabbat, and when we have the Shabbat, it's meant to be for us for all generations. And all right, Brad, I just emailed it to you. Hopefully this comes through. And it's given for all generations. This is the more particularistic view of Shabbat, in that it is part and parcel of our relationship with Hashem, right? Beni uvein bnei Yisrael ti le'olam. It is a sign between the two of us. And this duality of the two pieces of Shabbat, on the one hand, it being a universal experience for the entire globe, and at the same time, it's something specifically for the Jewish people, is reflected in multiple places. We see it reflected in the Psikta Rabbati, where Amar Rev Yudin, Zachor Natan Umot Elam, Shamor Natan Yisrael. As we said last week, that the duality is reflected in the notion of Shamor and Zachor, and even in the Friday night Kiddush, that we see that on the one hand, we have Zikaron L'Maaseh Bereshit. On the one hand, we have this idea that it's the remembrance of the time of the creation of the world. And on the end of the Kiddush, we see a second piece, which is Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim and Kivanu V'acharta V'otanu Kidashta, because you chose us, Hashem, and you made us holy. That second piece again, that is the Jewish unique perspective of all of it. And so we talked about those two pieces, and we're going to come back to how that also fits in to the structure of Kabbalat Shabbat. Now, the question is, how did Kabbalat Shabbat develop the way that we are used to and the way that we know? So if you open your Siddur, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what exactly Kabbalat Shabbat, when we talk about Kabbalat Shabbat, what we mean by this. If you have an art scroll, it's on page 308. I have not yet learned the Koran pages. But when you look at it, it begins with Psalm 95, Tehillim Tzadi Hey. So L'chunu Anan Hashem Nari Latzor Yishenu, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 prakim of Tehillim, then a 6th parak of Tehillim. Then we have Lecha Dodi. After Lecha Dodi, if you are to continue, I'm on 320 in the art scroll. You have Psalm 92, Psalm Tehillim Tzadi Bet, which is Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat, which last week we talked about as being integral to possibly how we actually do Kabbalat Shabbat, of accepting the strictures of Shabbat. And then we have Psalm 93, which follows, and then there's Bamed Madlikin, followed by Mariv. But so up until Bamed Madlikin, that is what we would call Kabbalat Shabbat. In the art scroll, it includes Bamed Madlikin as part of Kabbalat Shabbat. And possibly in next week's class, we'll talk a little bit about Bamed Madlikin, Kehagavna, and other customs like Shir Hashirim that were performed in this time. As a side note, I should have plugged this at the last class. I'm not sure I ever shared this with you, but I actually published a Siddur, a Friday night only Siddur, with Rabbi Yehuda Sarna and Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. And I should have brought it with you. It's in some box in my home, but I published a Siddur exploring some of these ideas there. So you can find it on Koran's website. It's the Koran Friday night Siddur. I don't get any money for the royalties on that. I made a terrible decision to only accept, when it was printed, they asked me if I wanted to go shopping at Koran, and whatever I could carry, I could take. And being like really young, I was really excited to get lots of free Koran, like Siddurim and whatnot. I didn't really think through the possibilities of what like passive income could look like. So I'm learning that for the next Siddur that I publish. In any case, so how do we get here? What happens? We know that Kabbalat Shabbat initially started in Sfat, like we said. But the truth is that it only really develops in this way that we know it, with these Tehillim, after the death of the Ari Zal. After the Ari passes away, that's the only time that we start to see different manifestations of including Tehillim in the actual Kabbalat Shabbat. And the question then is, what was it like before then, number one? And number two, what was so special about these Mizmorim? Like, why are these the chapters that were selected? If the Arizal and his followers and everyone in Sfat at this time, around the 1500s, were the creators of Kabbalat Shabbat and innovated in this space, well, then how come they chose? How did it become that these were the chapters of Tehillim that should be recited, and that this should become the formula? Now, we know, and we saw this a little bit last week, that there were different customs about how people would go to greet Shabbat. So we see in box number 5, this also came last week, that so how did the Ari in his time actually do Kabbalat Shabbat? He went outside, they went outside, and they literally welcomed in the Shabbat queen. There's this beautiful idea that Shabbat really serves as like a bride or a queen. Why a bride? Because every single day of the week, there's 7 days of the week. This comes, I think, in like the Chidushay, the Marshas talks about this, and others as well, that there are 6 days of the week. And that means that every day of the week has a partner, right? So I don't know who partners with who, but every single day of the week has a partner. But there's an odd man out, which is Shabbat. So Shabbat turns to Hashem and says, Hashem, Ribono Shalom, I have no partner. And Hashem says, no, you have the perfect partner. Your partner is going to be the Jewish people, and they're going to treat you like the queen that you are and the beautiful bride, and they're going to come and they're going to welcome you, and you're going to have this beautiful relationship. And the Rav has a beautiful idea that there's a fundamental difference between how we celebrate Friday nights, Kabbalat Shabbat, to Kabbalat Yom Tov. What is missing when it comes to welcoming in Yom Tov? What don't we do on an Erev Yontif in Shul? We don't say, sorry, please.
There's no Kabbalat Shabbat. You
Exactly.
don't say, well, that's a Tehillim.
Not in all communities. Ashkenaz, Germany, they say full Kabbalat Shabbat.
Well, you know what they say about Germans. No, I'm just kidding. No, I don't.
Oh, I'm
So-
serious.
That is true. That is true. And by the way, Arya, remind me to come back to that point at the end, because I think when we look through these Tehillim, why they were chosen, it might make sense why it's said even on Yom Tov. But the Rav has a beautiful idea in one of those books. I've read it over time, that there's a difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos. How do we celebrate Yom Tov? Yom Tov, think about the Shalosh Regalim. How do we experience it? The Jewish people leave their homes, and they go to Yerushalayim. They go to Hashem's house. That's how we celebrate it. That's the simcha of the day. Why is there Simchas Yom Tov? Because we're going to celebrate in God's home. But what is Shabbos? Shabbos is bringing the Shekhinah into our home. So what do we do before we even do Kiddush? Kiddush is literally sanctifying the day. What do? We sing Shalom Aleichem. We welcome the Shabbat bride and the Shabbat queen into our homes, because that is a form of this Kabbalat Shabbat. Now, where then did this custom, if it's really about going outside, and it was about, and the Ari and his followers and Sfat were just going and welcoming them, and there's the Shalom Aleichem, and there's all these other pieces. So then where did the custom develop that we started to say Tehillim? So there's a theory that's based on an interesting Sephardic custom. You have to remember that at this time, many of the Jews who are living in Sfat are Jews that were expelled or ran away from Spanish countries. And so the Sephardic influences were enormous at this time. And so there's two possibilities, or one possibility, two different sources that prove this to us. Take a look in box number 6 and box number 7. So let's talk not just about what happens when Shabbat begins with Kabbalat Shabbat. How do we celebrate the end of Shabbat? So the Sefer HaMinhag says as follows. It was the custom in Spain to recite songs before Havdalah in a synagogue, while in France and in Provence, it was the custom to do so at home. I found in a midrash that we conduct ourselves toward Shabbos in a manner similar to how we act in accompanying a bride or a king. We accompany them with songs and with words of praise. Shabbos was compared to a queen and a bride, and we found the following excerpt from Sechet Shabbos, like I just said, "Come, my bride, let us go out and welcome the Shabbos queen." We further learn in Breishi Rabbah on the verse that God finished on the 7th day, that Hashem said, "Come and say words of song, because a new face has come here." In other words, like the entry of a bride who each week appears as if for the first time. So there was this custom that emerged that on Motzei Shabbos, they used to say Tehillim. And that was the custom. You look in box number 7 in the Sefer Abu Dram, in his Seder Motzei Shabbos, he writes, it was that custom on Motzei Shabbos before Mariv to recite chapters of Tehillim. How do we observe Motzei Shabbos? We run home as fast as we can. We turn on, as soon as it's over, we turn on our phones, check the scores, check to see what's going on in the world, get first in line at Pizza Block to get the first pizza. That's what we do. What did they used to do? They used to slow things down. And by slowing things down, they would say these extra prakim of Tehillim as a way to send off the Shabbat queen. And so one possibility that is suggested is that this is where the idea of adding Tehillim came on the front end. So if the Sephardic tradition, and by the way, if you open up like a Moroccan siddur today, I tried so hard last night to find something, a Moroccan siddur. I think I actually own one, but I couldn't find it. If anyone owns one or knows where we can find one, we can open up and see. I'm pretty sure that even to this day, the Moroccan tradition in the siddur includes Mizmorim, that includes chapters of Tehillim, and that's how they ended Shabbat. So possibly the thought was, we need to go and add these to welcome in the Shabbat as well. And this notion of spending extra time and doing extra things to welcome Shabbat is something that we actually find in lots of other places. And so it would make sense that if we had the custom on the end of Shabbat to include Mizmorim of Tehillim, then we would also, and we are accustomed to preparing for Shabbat in other ways, that we'd also do so. So for example, the Rambam writes in Hilchot Shabbos, and I think we all do this in some way, shape, or form, but the Rambam says in Hilchot Shabbos that Misader Adam Shulchano Be'erev Shabbat, V'af al pi she'eno tzarich el lekazayid, a person needs to prepare their Shabbos table on Erev Shabbos, even if they just need a small amount. And more than that, he should further prepare his table on Motzei Shabbos, even if all he plans to eat is a small amount. What does this mean on Motzei Shabbos? There's an idea of Malava Malka. A person is supposed to continue and take the beauty of Shabbat and continue it on to Motzei Shabbos. If Shabbos is both the end of the week and the beginning of the week, It's meant to energize us, and we're supposed to take some of the Kodesh with us onto the Chol. And so this is part of the preparations. And you can see I gave you a bunch of other sources as well about how we know just how important preparation is for Shabbat. And if preparation is important for Shabbat, then certainly also leaving Shabbat is important as well. So, for example, you see here in Shemot Perek Tet Zayin, chapter 16, box number 9, Vayomer Aleichem, Hu Asher Diber Hashem Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh Lashem, Machar Eit Asher Tofu Ofu, Veit Asher Tavashlu Bashelu. What's God telling us? That Shabbos is a day of rest. And so bake what you would bake and boil what you would boil today because you can't do it tomorrow. In other words, there's an issue of hachana. And by the way, if you think that like hachana and preparation is just like, okay, everyone got to prepare your meals, it goes so much deeper than that. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, when he's talking about how prophecy works, this is actually like a true story. One of my oldest and closest friends, when I met him in yeshiva, he told me that he was going to take a week off from yeshiva because he wanted to shepherd, do some shepherding. I was like, what a weird thing to do, but all right, he wanted to be a shepherd. And I noticed that with his belongings, he brought with himself like a flute. I said, a flute? What do you have a flute for? Like, it's weird enough that you're going shepherding. Why are you bringing a flute? He said, listen, you got to play the odds. If you want to get prophecy, look through all the Nevi'im. They were shepherds, they played instruments. So you got to play the odds if you want to get prophecy. So I got to go do what I can do. Maybe I'll get stricken with prophecy. And so it doesn't really work like that, obviously. I'm making a joke. But if you look in the Moreh Nevuchim, look how the Rambam describes what's necessary for a person to receive prophecy. Haroi l'nevuah, even if a person has the capacity for nevuah, is what? Hamechin atzmo, is a person who is preparing for it, right? Allah, afshar shelo yinaveh, v'zeh b'ratzon Elokai, it's ultimately in God's hands. V'zeh etzli hu kidmu taniflaot kulam, nimshach min agam sha'inyan hativi. And it may happen that even if he prepares, he might not actually prophesize. And in that case, that's God holding it back from him for some way. Skip to the end of that line, or the third line, really, right in the middle of the page, which is Behiyot b'nei hanavi'im, to be one of the children of the Nevi'im, mit askim tamid b'achana. What did the prophets used to do? The sons of the prophets were constantly engaged in preparation. So this preparation for Shabbat, to be able to do Kabbalat Shabbat, is part and parcel of how we are able to prepare ourselves spiritually. It's not just preparing meals, but we have to prepare ourselves spiritually. And the Gemara in Shabbos, I won't read it inside, but like it's very well known. You can see it for yourselves. And box 11 describes all the different ways that the great sages used to act in order to prepare themselves for Shabbat. Well, what would they do? They would get the best meats, and they would prepare the stoves, and they would spin the wicks for the Shabbat candles, and so on and so forth. And they did all those things because the preparation itself is so significant. And this always reminds me of this quote from Rav Soloveitchik, which I want to read to you, which again, you may know, but I think it fits nicely into this context as we think about the purpose of for what the purpose of these Tehillim play and Kabbalat Shabbat. So he writes as follows, and I just want to read it because he says it better than any way that I could summarize. So the Rav says as follows: allow me please to make a private confession concerning a matter that has caused me such loss of sleep. I'm not so very old yet. I remember a time when 90% of world Jewry were observant, and the secularists were a small minority at the fringes of the camp. And I still remember it was not so long ago when Jews were still close to Hashem and lived in an atmosphere perverted with holiness. But today, what do we see? The profane and the secular are in control wherever we turn. And even in those neighborhoods made up predominantly of religious Jews who can no longer talk of the quote unquote sanctity of the Shabbat day, true, there are Jews in America who observe the Shabbat. The label Sabbath observer, the label being a Shomer Shabbos, has come to be used as a title of honor in our circles, just like Harav HaGaon, right? The title of being a great rabbi. Neither really indicates anything, and both testify to the lowly state of our generation. But it is not for the Shabbat that my heart aches. It is for the eve of the Shabbat. There are Shabbat observing Jews in America, but there are not, quote unquote, Erev Shabbat Jews who go out to greet the Shabbat with beating hearts and pulsating souls. There are many who observe the precepts with their hands, with their feet, and or with their mouths, but there are few indeed who truly know the meaning. Really powerful words by the Rav. The words of these Kabbalat Shabbat, these Tehillim, are here in particular to help us as part of our actual preparations. It comes before Mariv. They come before Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat. It all is in preparation. So let's say you didn't have time, you're coming at 4 o'clock and it's a short Shabbos and you didn't have time to go spin the wicks like the Gemara talks about, and you didn't do the Hachana. Kabbalat Shabbat, it's not just about greeting the Shabbat queen. Yes, it's true. It's not just about Kabbalat Ta'anit, the acceptance of stricture. It's about using these Mizmorei Tehillim, using Kabbalat Shabbat as part of our Hachana, as part of our way that we prepare to be truly Erev Shabbos Jews. And in a perfect world, we would really take the time on Fridays, or starting on Thursday night. Rav Elazar Melamed has a whole section in one of his Pinyanei Halachas about this, that we really should be taking the time to be preparing for Shabbat in such a way. It shouldn't just be the 30 seconds that we run into Kabbalat Shabbat, that we run through it, or we're half asleep. And by the way, if the custom came primarily because the Sephardic tradition around the 15 and 1600s were to do Tehillim on Motzei Shabbos, to send Shabbos off in that way, so all the more so when Shabbos ends, we should also take pause and not be so quick to send it away. We also should slow it down as well. And so I think some food for thought for us. But let's now dig even deeper. Why? We spent a minute now just talking about why Tehillim in general and where that might have come from. Now let's spend a minute thinking a little bit about why these specific prakim of Tehillim, and is there any significance of these 5 in particular? Meaning, were these 5 chosen just because they just are interesting? Because they, if you notice, by the way, that it's actually 6, I should say. There's 5 in a row, beginning again on page 308 in your Siddur, if you want to follow along, if you have an art scroll. So again, beginning with Tehillim chapter 95, Tzadi Hey. So it was it just like we chose some Tehillim that were in order and we threw it in here? What is so significant about these? So this would be the audience participation part. So feel free. Why did we choose these 5? Or why did whoever chose them choose them? Don't all jump at once. The crowd here in the show is getting rowdy. Calm down, everybody. So let's start by looking at the first Tehillim. How does the first Tehillim begin? How does Kabbalat Shabbat begin? L'chu ne'ran el Hashem, right? Nariya l'tzorishenu. Come, let us sing to Hashem, and let us call out to the rock of our salvation. So that, in a little bit, even on its most basic level, perhaps this ties into what the Ari and his followers were doing. They were going out, they're saying, come everybody, come, let's sing to Hashem, Boi Kala, Shabbat Malkata. So it could be that this is chosen because it starts with these words, and it's not uncommon when putting together prayer and tefillah in the Jewish, in our faith, to choose Tehillim that kind of come together. Think about Hallel, for example. Hallel is a continual piece of a section of Tehillim, one parak after the next. Or we see this even a little bit like with the Halukas, or we see this in Psukkah Zimra. It's not uncommon for us to select Tehillim that are that are next to each other, one chapter after the next, after the next. So it could be that the only reason why these were chosen were because of the words L'chu Niran and Hashem. That's possible. One thing that we have to ask ourselves, though, is that it starts with Tehillim Tzadi Hey, so chapter 95. We see chapter 96, chapter 97, chapter 98, chapter 99. What do you expect to see next after chapter 99? Chapter 100, right? Chapter 100.
Yeah.
What is the next chapter instead? What happens after we read Psalm 99, Tehillim Tzadi Tet? What do we then move to?
29.
29.
Kaf Tet, 29. So it's very strange. So like, if our theory is that the structure is, if our theory is the structure is related to the notion that these should all be sequential in some way, then we would have expected there to be Psalm 100. Well, what is Psalm 100? Anybody know off the top of their head what Psalm is Psalm 100? We say it every single day. Mizmor LaTodah, you can see it in your Siddur in the middle of Sukkot Zimmer. Mizmor LaTodah, Hariu LaHashem Kol Haaretz. It's a psalm of thanksgiving. Call out to Hashem, everyone on earth. So, that maybe should fit here, and we're going to have to dig a little bit deeper. So let's try to understand a little bit more about why they were here. So one thought, let's just talk about the number of Tehillim first. Why were why 6 Tehillim? So one possibility could be that it corresponds to the days of the week. 5 Tehillim, the first 5, chapters 95 to 99, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, those 5 correspond to the 5 days of the week. Then we move on to chapter 29, and chapter 29 corresponds to what? To Friday, which is a holy day, as we just spoke about. And the whole idea of
but this is one that we always say when we bring back the Torah on Shabbos also, not just Friday night.
Good. I don't know who just said that because I can't see you, but
it's Beth. Good. It's Beth Apfelbaum.
Thank you, Beth. Yeah, so Beth is 100% right. So we're going to have to ask ourselves the question of why would this be repeated, right? Like, if we want to make sure we say it, well, why is it being repeated now? We're going to come back to that. Great observation. And you'll notice, though, there's actually a 7th Tehillim that we say. There's actually an 8th as well. The 7th Tehillim is Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, which is Psalm 92, which happens after the Chadodi, which has to do with Shabbat. So one theory that is suggested is that we say the 5 chapters of Tehillim to correspond to the 5 days of the week, and the Havu Hashem, which is Psalm 29, that represents Friday. Mizmor Shir represents Shabbat. And what's fascinating is that some earlier versions of Kabbalat Shabbat did actually include Psalm 100, Mizmor LaTodah. That got cut out. And it probably was included because, again, it's Mizmor LaTodah, it's giving thanks to Hashem, which thematically does seem to fit in. What's interesting, though, is that if you flip over your page to box 13, and this would be a lot easier to do if we were in person. So we're going to just do a little bit of it, but not a lot. But if people are really interested in this, I can try to think about how to do this on Zoom. If you look through the Tehillim, Professor Yaakov Licht, in an article called Kfutza Shel Mizmorim Lechavod Malchut Hashem, he writes about how there is more to the theme, or more to the connection between these Mizmorim. It's not just that they happen to be sequential, but there's actually like deep thematic connections to them. So let's just see what he says and see if we can try to interpret what he's thinking. So he says as follows: we're accustomed in our study to deal with the isolated psalms of the book of Tehillim without paying a special attention to sets or collections of psalms that are included in the book of Tehillim that is before us. At first glance, this practice is justified. For most of these sets and collections, the Tehillim were joined together in a mechanical manner or according to superficial criteria by way of association. There is, however, no rule without an exception to the rule. And below, he's writing, this is like a long article, I'll try to point to one set in the book of Tehillim, which is not a collection of psalms void of an inner connection, but rather a sort of literary work in its own right. And this is a work that is indeed comprised of independent parts, but nevertheless unites those parts both in content and in form, and in their combined state bestows upon them additional meaning and new significance. So what he's trying to say here is that these Tehillim are purposely lumped together sequentially because they are here to teach us something. Psalms 95 through 100, notice he includes 100 here, join together to form a separate group by virtue of 3 common features: a unified theme, several repeated expressions, and parallelism in structure and conceptual connection. And what's important here is that we do not find the partner of any psalm in our group adjacent to it. Were there 3 consecutive pairs of psalms, 1, 2, and then 2, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, this would merely reflect the editor's desire to juxtapose similar psalms. But integrating the pairs into each other attests to the objective of the combination and preserves the unity of the group. The format of the combination of 3 pairs distinguishes between a frame, 1, 1, and the body of the group, 2, 3, 2, 3. And so he goes and does a much more detailed analysis. So let's look back through the Tehillim together. And again, I'm going to apologize. This is a lot easier to do when we're like in person. But let's see how this works on Zoom. Which prakim of Tehillim would you say link with which parakim of Tehillim. You can look for a moment in your Siddur. What, in your opinion, according to Professor Licht, and by the way, the Dat Mikra also has a similar, not quite the same academic approach, but a similar way of reading these Tehillim as well. How would you express them in connection to each other? Which are partners with the other?
The first two, the Chumash and Shibur, it's the same thing. They start the same way.
Why? What about Tehillim? 1 second, Ari. What about Psalm 98? Mizmor Shiru Hashem. Why is that different?
I don't know, but
Because it starts with Mizmor as opposed to just Shiru.
So let's start from the middle section. Which two look like really similar? Look at Psalm 97 and Psalm 99. Notice how they both start exactly the same way.
Hashem Malach,
Hashem Melech.
Malach.
Hashem
Hashem
Malach.
Malach Tagel Haaretz. Hashem Malach Yirgazu Amin. Right? So here you have two examples of they start in the same way. And again, we can go much deeper into this, which we will in a moment. Now take out Psalm 95 for just one moment. Let's just put that on the side, Psalm 95, okay? Now let's look at Psalm 96 and Psalm 98. One is Shiru LaHashem Shir Chadash, and one is what? Mizmor Shiru LaHashem Shir Chadash. So what Professor Licht is arguing is that if you want to truly show the interconnection between something and create a body of work, so you could take the partner Tehillim and put Psalm 96 right next to Psalm 98, and then you'll have them be like partners. They are talking about similar ideas. But if you want to show how the whole unit is a unit, what would you do? You would separate them accordingly. That we still have to figure out what is Psalm 95's likely partner then? Well, Psalm 100. L'chun ran Hashem, come let us sing to Hashem. And what is Psalm 100 again? I'll pull it back up here. Sorry, I should save the page. Psalm 100 reads, Mizmor Todah hariu LaHashem kol haaretz. Right? Call out to Hashem, everybody on earth. Come, let us sing to Hashem. Let us call out to the rock of our salvation. Similar ideas here that we're finding in both the Mizmor L'Todah and Psalm 95 of L'chu Niranana. And there's a lot more similarities. So for example, Professor Licht talks about how Psalm 96 and Psalm 98 are both Psalms of praise, and they appeal to those who are present to praise Hashem, and a rationale for that appeal beginning with the word with ki, because it uses the word ki, like because. And if you were to look on a much higher level, if you were to look at let's just again look at Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, who is that addressing? Like, what is the theme of those two? Like, who is that psalm speaking to? Who is the audience?
No, it's everybody.
It looks a little bit what? It looks a little bit, when you look at 96 and 98, I just have to open it up for myself, that this is let me give you the hint. Take a look at Psalm 98, the last line in Tzadichet. Narochim chalachach yachad harim yiranenu. Lifnei Hashem, in front of Hashem, kiva lishpot ta'aretz. Who is judging? God is judging the entirety of the world, right? Yishpot tevel b'tzedek v'amim b'meisharim. This is more of a universalistic approach, which I think goes back to how we started, of how we look at Shabbat. On the other hand, when we look a little bit deeper here, and we look at Hashem Malach and Gazu Amim, notice how it talks about Moshe, Yaron, Mechoanav in Psalm 99. That has nothing to do with the rest of the world. That's Jewish all the way, baby. This perhaps again refers to that duality that we started with of Shabbat being both the Shabbat for the whole world, but also Oti Le'olam. It's also something unique and particular to the Jewish people. So how then do we make sense of Psalm 95? So if you look in Psalm 95, I think what we could argue here is that if you look carefully here in Psalm 95, that it actually breaks up into two different parts. Notice, how does it end? Arba'im shana akut bedor. 40 years I was angry with the generation. Who does that sound like it's talking to?
Yisrael. It's
It's
about
talking
the
about the Jewish
Yisrael.
people. Correct. That's the particularistic piece. And when we look at the beginning, let's all go out, right? A great God is Hashem, great King above all heavenly powers. For His power are the hidden mysteries of the earth. So we see that perhaps that Psalm 95 is like I'm trying to think of the way to describe it. Imagine like a flow chart where it has both elements, and then Psalm 96.
Awesome.
For the Jewish people, and then that takes us to here, Psalm 92. Now we're just running short on time, so we can go further in depth. So please message me afterwards if you're finding this interesting. I'm happy to do more of this, like real closer analysis next week. But what's interesting, besides for what makes these 5 fit, is that this was not actually the only sets of Tehillim that were chosen. There were, if you take a sampling of old Sidurim, which I've done, and you can just look them up in any library, you'll notice that they do a whole bunch of other ones. Some of them omit Tehillim 95 to 99 and only include Tehillim Kaftet 29, which we still have to talk about. Some included other things, like there's a Sefer Tefillot Yesharim, which was published in 1800 in Italy. And it begins with Psalm 29 with Kaftet. And then it has this line, I wrote it over here for myself, that after you say Psalm 29, listen to this. Uksat chasidim na'agu lekrot shir hashirim kodem achnasat Shabbat. Some chasidim had the custom to read shir hashirim before Shabbos. Ve'achar kach, and afterwards, mizmor tzadi hey, tzadi vav, tzadi zayin, tzadi chet, tzadi tet. Ve'achar kach omrin mizmor zeh, Psalm 29. In other words, if you, according to this siddur from the 1800s that had a different set and sequence, if you say Tehillim the way that we say it, if you say Kabbalat Shabbat the way that you do today, you're a chassid, you're a real chassid. So that was the custom. And you can even see, like I put a box here, this is taken out of a siddur. Look how the Yesh no Hagim Lomar Elu. These were the random Tehillim that were chosen in another siddur. Or if you look in the part underneath that box, this is from a handwritten Siddur that was given attribution to the Ari around like the 1500s. And notice that the only thing that seems to be included here is Psalm 29. And the only other part before that is where he says like Likrat Shabbat Malkata, right? Like he talks about like we have to welcome the Shabbat queen, but nothing about these other Tehillim at all. And so the question is, why are there so many different customs? Like when we think about davening is pretty much like a set thing. There's not a lot of innovation. Well, here's the thing. Kabbalat Shabbat involves a ton of innovation because it was not composed by it's not like the Shemona Esrei composed by Anshe Knesset Hagadola. Quite the opposite. It was something that really evolved with time, which, by the way, there in some shuls, the custom was to daven Kabbalat Shabbat outside of the actual sanctuary, like in an annex room, somewhere else outside, or even outside the building itself. This had nothing to do with Corona or anything like that. They just chose to be outside. Because to show and to signify that Kabbalat Shabbat is not a true tefillah. By the way, today in Israel, this is something that on a personal level drives me crazy. And I'll explain that another time if you'd like to know why. In Israel, oftentimes you'll find young boys who are under bar mitzvah who will be accustomed to lead Kabbalat Shabbat, as if to signify that Kabbalat Shabbat is not really part of davening in the same way, which is why some shuls even bring for Kabbalat Shabbat, even though playing an instrument on Shabbat would be a problem. This developed, and this don't have this in our shul. The chassan will daven for Kabbalat Shabbat and move to a second bima, signify that we did this welcoming of Shabbat in the most spiritual and holy way. But now, fast forward, we're now going to go do something totally different, and we're now going to focus on Marv and actually accepting Shabbat in this way. So why does this happen this way? Why are there all these different traditions and different ways that people did it? So I don't want to sound like so negative about this, but I think it's really simple. Sidurim are books. I don't mean to sound like, I mean, it's a holy book, but in the same way that Koren, a decade ago, 15 years ago, whenever they decided to publish their new OU Jonathan Sacks Sidur, they're a publisher, and they also made some small changes. They didn't change the primary texts, but they threw in, a couple extra paragraphs for Yom Ha'atzmaut, and they reorganized the layout of the pages, and they do it. Why does a publisher do that? Because they want to sell books. So if you're in the Middle Ages or whatever, you're living in the 1700s, 1800s, wherever it is that you're living, and you're a publisher, you want to sell more Sidurim. Well, how are you going to sell more Sidurim? Well, you're going to go and innovate where you can. Where's the perfect place to innovate? In the place that's not really a full davening. Now, we've accepted upon ourselves that Kabbalat Shabbat really is part of the davening, and it's made its way in. That's, you can think like the more modern printings of like modern Sidurim, like even before the Art Scroll Sidur, but Art Scroll definitely plays an important part in that, in setting what our customs were. But the truth is, it really seems that from the time of the Ari until sometime, I don't know, the 1800s, 1900s, whatever it might be, that there were lots of different customs and different publishers did different things. And they did that because they were trying probably to sell more Sidurim. I don't mean that in a negative way. They were doing a tremendous service to the Jewish people to inspire people by seeing different ways to do Kabbalat Shabbat. But all that being said, despite the fact expressing different customs to whether it's these five in this table of contents under box 13, that there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chapters, including some of the famous Shir Malos. One thing seems to always show up, and this goes back to Beth's point, is that we always seem to say Psalm 29. And not only do we seem to say Psalm 29, it actually seems to replace Psalm 100. Is it about Psalm significant that not only do we say it when we return the Torah to the Aron, to the Ark, but that we also are saying it in such a prominent place, and everybody, seemingly even maybe the Ari, would say, what is it about that psalm that's so significant? So in order to understand that in our last few minutes that we have together, and by the way, feel free if you have questions, just send them in the chat or to ask them here, whatever you're most comfortable with. Let's here in I want us to look for how the doc actually explains some of the themes of our Tehillim that we've said. Now, a little bit about it being like Shabbos being the whole world versus something unique for the Jewish people. Let's look at how the Radak gives some commentary on these Mizmorei Tehillim. So look in box 14. What does the Radak say? Ken Yomru Yisrael b'mot HaMashiach ish le'achav shiranenu lakel shehoshiam. So will the Jewish people say one to the other in the days of the Mashiach, they should sing loudly in honor of Hashem who rescues them. Okay, that's one comment he makes. That this is a phrase that will be said in some future time. Look in the next parak Tzadi Bav. Shir Lashem Shir Chadash, Shir Lashem Kol Haaretz. Kamosha Amar L'chu Nran Hashem. Just like we said in the previous verse, Yomar Ish Lachiv Shir Lashem Shir Chadash. That God is going to gather the people from all the nations of the world from the diaspora. And King David here uses the word new. Why? To mean that a new song will be sung relative to the existing songs. What does it mean, a new song? That in the times of Mashiach, that it's going to be something new. Now we can look at, we can continue to analyze these Mizmorei Tehillim, but the Radak seems to find a theme that if you read through the Radak, you'll notice that these Mizmorim, he seems to tie in a lot of messianic ideas to these actual Mizmorim, these actual psalms. But notice how the Radak describes Psalm 29. He has a bit of a different approach here. Take a look in box number 16. Kol Hashem al Hamayim. So what do we mean by this? Kol Hashem al Hamayim. So Darshu Rabbeinu Zal, our sages teach from the Mechilta, B'zeh HaMizmor Shnemar al Yom Matan Torah. What is the significance of this Mizmor? This was the Mizmor that was said on the day that the Torah itself was given to the Jewish people. This was the Mizmor. So now we can understand Why do we say this mizmor when we take the Torah back on Shabbos? We say this mizmor because this was said on when the Torah was given. Well, you might want to know, how come during the week we say different mizmor, when we take the Torah back, we don't say Psalm 29, we say, what number psalm is it? The David mizmor, which is Psalm number 24. Yeah, Psalm 24. So why do we make a difference? I can't remember if this is 100% accurate, but my hypothesis has to do with what we see here in boxes 17 and 18. So number one, in box 17, we notice in Halacha Gimel and Maseches Ktanos, you could just skip to the bottom in the English because we're running short on time, that there were different mizmorim that were said on different holidays. So for example, on Hanukkah, the chapter that begins, Aramimcha Hashem was said on Hanukkah. On Purim, they said Shiyon LeDavid, and on Shavuos, what did they say? Havu L'Hashem B'nei Eli, which is this mizmor. Why do they say Psalm 29 on Shavuos? What's the connection? Because this was the psalm that the Jewish people said when they got the Torah. But what is the connection then between Torah and specifically Shabbos? And what is the connection between Kabbalat Shabbat, or returning the Torah specifically on Shabbos? So the Gemara in Shabbos itself tells us, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages teach here, Bashishi B'chodesh Nitnu Aser Dibur L'Yisrael. There's a machlokas as to what day. It's actually a wild thing. How could we not know what day Shavuos is supposed to fall on and what day the Torah was given? There's a Gemara was talking about this. On the 6th day on the month of Sivan, that's the day that we got the Aser Dibros. So that's the opinion. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shiva, Rabbi Yossi disagrees. It's the 7th. It's like the most wild thing, the most important moment in all of human history. There's we don't know the exact another time. Amar Rav, Rabba says everyone holds Rosh Chodesh. They got to, says here by Yom Hazeh Ba'u Midbar Sinai Uktiv Haptam. It says here that they came on this day, and over there it says HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim Ma'alahalan Rosh Chodesh. Just like over there when it says HaChodesh Hazeh on this day, the word this, it was talking about Rosh Chodesh. Afkan Rosh Chodesh, it also has to refer to Rosh Chodesh. And not only that, he says Udakuli Alma. Everybody agrees. Rabba says that what the Shabbos Nitna Torah Yisrael. Everybody agrees that the day of the week that we got the Torah was Shabbos. It doesn't matter, you hold the 6th day or the 7th day, everybody agrees that the Torah was given on Shabbos. Why do we say Psalm 29 specifically on Shabbos when we return the Torah to the Ark? Because this was the mizmor, it was on Shabbos that we got the Torah. It makes sense that as we're returning the Torah back to the Ark, that we should say that mizmor. So what is the significance then of including it as part of Kabbalat Shabbat as well? So there's a beautiful Sfas Emes that you can look at from this coming week's Parsha that kind of talks about this deep connection here, which is that well, let me actually take a look at it for a moment. Let's take a look at this Sfas Emes. So he wants to know the pasuk Zachor Yom HaShoah Kadsho Ki Ma'az Atam. He wants to know, why should we commemorate Shabbos by making it sanctified? Why? Ki sheishidem asak because God told us, and we have to rest on Shabbat. This really is a testimony for the Jewish people. And what is it that that Shabbat is really all about? It's really about the Chazal Amru, skipping down a line. The Shabbos nitna Torah dichtiv zachor be'atzamo shel yom mashma. It's implied shebekoach kabbalat Torah nitan lanu haShabbat. Because of the koach of accepting the Torah, that is what gave us the ability to, God gave us Shabbat. There's this deep, deep connection. So let's go back to Kabbalat Shabbat as we're running out of time. Kabbalat Shabbat, according to Radak, one of the themes potentially for those first 5 Mizmorim has to do with Mashiach, has to do with messianic times. And suddenly we interrupt this like very spiritual idea of messianic times, which fits perfectly with what was going on with the mysticism in Sfat at the time. We interrupt that our regularly scheduled program to all of a sudden bring you something to do with Shabbat. Why? Because the only way that we're going to be able to live a life of Shakulo Shabbos, a time when it all Shabbos, the most holy and spiritual time, meaning the times of Mashiach, the only way to get there is through the Torah itself. The only way is through Shabbos and Torah. It's that dual connection that Sfas Emes here is talking about. And this is the reason why in the times they were trying to do everything they could to bring about Mashiach, to bring this Yom Shikul Shabbos. And so this is the reason why they put this psalm here, that everybody said that we have to say this psalm, because the way in which we achieve our goals of finding the highest level of spirituality, not just on a particularistic level for us as Jews, but on a worldwide, universalistic way, the way that we do this is through the power of Torah and the power of Shabbos. And the only way to really achieve that power, it comes back to what the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim, is through hachana. It's through our preparations. It's through Kabbalat Shabbat. And so what I want to suggest here is that these Tehillim, they serve as kind of like again, a duality. On the one hand, talking about Mashiach, on the other hand, talking about Torah and Shabbos, and that is the way that we're able to achieve it and help us get in that right mindset. So when we're saying these Tehillim, these are some of the things that we can have in mind. Next week, please God, we're going to continue. You're welcome to join us in Zoom or in person. And next week, we'll talk a little bit more about Lechadodi and also some of the extras things that are said as part of Kabbalat Shabbat as well. So happy to stick on for questions if people have questions. But if not, I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. Stay warm and safe, especially tomorrow. I think there's going to be maybe some snow and ice, and hope to see everybody really soon. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.